Samia previously worked as a Morocco-based journalist. She was a research associate with the University of Cambridge on Moroccan media. Samia is an alumna of both George Mason University's Global Affairs program and Georgetown University's Master of Arts in Arab Studies program. All right, Samia, thank you very much for coming.
All right, it's really great to be back to my former home. I'm going to approach my topic from the perspective of my experience as a journalist. So that means I'm going to focus a little bit more on Morocco than the rest of the Maghreb. But I hope that sort of the experience that I bring, being a reporter on the ground, reporting on some of the events that I'm going to be speaking about, will sort of add a little bit more color and help illustrate what's happening on the ground, take us away from, you know, being here in academia and what's unfolding among people in the region. So I want to start with the story of a 19-year-old girl. Her name was Hayat Belqasem. She was a law student from the city of Tétouan in northern Morocco. On September 25th, she was on a boat headed to Spain in an attempt to migrate, like many, many other Moroccans do. The Moroccan Royal Navy opened fire, killing her. This event sparked widespread indignation, partially because it's unprecedented, all right? Moroccan Navy has never shot and killed someone of Morocco, a Moroccan citizen. This happened during a time when Moroccans have been fleeing the country in unprecedented rates. According to the Moroccan government, 54,000 attempts have been made to migrate from Morocco to Europe, 13% of which were Moroccans, right? So as many of you know, Morocco is a major destination for migrants attempting to eventually end in Europe. So this is sort of something that I want to open with in Morocco. In Algeria, last month it was announced that the ruling party, the FLN, had nominated 81-year-old wheel-bound chair President Bouteflika as their presidential candidate for the upcoming presidential elections. Bouteflika has been president since 1991, and if this ends up going through and he wins the election, this would mark his 5th term as president of Algeria. This comes after Bouteflika has purged numerous military generals in an attempt to sort of dissolve the influence of the military in Algerian politics, and a number of these generals have faced criminal charges, many dealing with corruption. Now over to Tunisia. A few weeks ago, a jobless graduate, she blew herself up in the heart of Tunis. This was initially reported as a potential terror attack related to ISIS, but it was then revealed that she was an unemployed graduate who lost all hope and resulted to a suicide bomb. This comes at after tensions have been unfolding within the Tunisian government between Prime Minister Youssef Chahid and President Beji Qaid Sebsi. Prime Minister Chahid has recently reshuffled the cabinet in a move that has sparked and drew harsh remarks from President Beji Qaid Sebsi, who says he was not consulted with the decision. These tensions mark a trend among and within the Tunisian government since 2011. This is also within the context of major economic crisis in Tunisia after the IMF issued a $2.8 billion loan in 2016 that came with the stipulation of implementing stark austerity measures. So the title of this talk is the Maghreb, and I want to emphasize that the Maghreb is not just Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia. It's also Libya, it's Mauritania, it's the Western Sahara. I'm focusing on Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia for several reasons, primarily because they share a shared colonial past, and they're oftentimes cited within the context of Arab Spring as sort of different cases, right? So Morocco has been described as the exception, okay? Algeria has been described as the anomaly, and Tunisia has been described as a model. So they're different, right? But what do they have in common? They all share an overwhelming sense of political economic stagnation. Why am I choosing stagnation here? So it kind of depends on how you define change, right? So if we're defining change based off of leadership, is the leadership the same or different? We can look at Morocco and Algeria. The leadership has not changed. King Mohammed VI and President Bouteflika have been the leaders of their countries since the late 1990s. The current president of Tunisia served under Ben Ali, ousted Ben Ali. He served under his administration years ago, decades ago, in fact. But if we're defining change based off of the presence of protests or lack of protests, then the answer is quite simple. Protests haven't stopped, okay? Protests have endured, and I will focus on particular examples in each of the countries where this is the case. And then if we're measuring change by sort of the policies that are being implemented, I think we can all categorically say that none of the policies that have been implemented in any of these countries have genuinely diffused power away from the center. In some, not much has really changed in the Maghreb, unfortunately. And this is sort of the justification for my use of the word stagnation here. I welcome critiques on this. Happy to discuss if there are those who disagree. So on the other hand, uprisings have taken on an enduring presence in the region. There's an enduring aftermath of the 2011 uprisings, which is why I'm using the word afterlives. I use afterlives here to argue that the uprisings and their impact are not entirely dead, and they're also not as uniformly visible as they were in 2011. As I mentioned, the reforms have not entirely led to a diffusion of power away from the center, and I will go into examples of this. And ultimately, expressions of dissent and social mobilization continue and are constantly adjusting to the shifting power dynamics in these countries. So what I will conclude with at the end of this is that this indicates that we have not seen the end of political change in the Maghreb. So I want to focus on a few examples that reflect what I've been arguing so far. In January 2018 in Tunisia, a movement called Fesh Nitsinau began. Now that translates to what are we waiting for? The protests were mainly aimed at the recent austerity measures that Tunisia put in place. Throughout the course of the protests, which lasted about a month, over 800 people were arrested, and there was at least one death. Like I said, the protests came after Tunisia signed a 4-year loan program worth $2.8 billion in 2016. And this came with very stark conditions of implementing political economic reforms that were intended to reduce public spending. And as we know, these austerity measures were very similar to the measures that fueled the initial protests in 2011 in Tunisia. Now, Algeria. Last November, we had the beginning of the longest labor strike in Algerian history. It was led by the Autonomous Collective of Algerian Medical Residents. It constituted members of the medical community, primarily medical students and doctors. They were demanding an end to compulsory service in Algeria and improved working conditions as well as better pay. Like I said, the strike began in November. It counted upwards of 15,000 participants. It ended in June, but throughout the course of that strike, dozens have been injured as well as arrested. Now on to Morocco, which I'm going to dwell on a little bit. In 2016, a fish vendor by the name of Mohsin Fikri was crushed alive in a garbage truck. Police seized his fish and threw it in the garbage truck, and he jumped in a desperate attempt to maintain his stock. The incident was recorded and widely disseminated, and the next day, protests began in what would end up being dubbed the Hirak movement. This unfolded in the city of Al Hoceima, located in the north of Morocco, in the Rif region, which those of you who are familiar with Moroccan history know that the Rif region has been sort of a hotbed of dissent and opposition to the central authority of Morocco. So throughout marked by the beginning of his death, activists and journalists have been arrested on an unprecedented scale. Foreign journalists who came to cover the protests were expelled. This happened for European journalists, American journalists, as well as scholars and researchers who attempted to go to Al Hoceima and try to understand what's unfolding here. Now, to give you sort of a little picture of what it was like when I was, as part of my job reporting, I went to Hoceima several times within the course of these protest movements. Each time, We had to go through extensive security checkpoints regardless of our entry point of the city, whether we were coming in from the south or the north or the east. And throughout these security checkpoints, you go through multiple ones that are run by the police, the gendarmes, and they're extensive, right? They're checking your IDs, and they reserve the right to refuse you entry, which they have done. Not to just residents in the area who were trying to participate in the protests, but also to journalists attempting to cover it. And so we had the rise of the Hirak movement. A leader emerged, Nasser Zivzafi, who was arrested after he protested against a sermon delivered in a mosque. He's currently in jail, sentenced to, I believe, 20 years in prison, as well as other activists who were involved with the Hirak movement. Once that waned, we saw the emergence of another movement, and this was different. It was a boycott, okay? And it started on social media, and it's still not clear as to who actually started this call for a boycott of the three major companies in Morocco. You have Afriqiya, a gas company that is owned and managed by Aziz Akhnouch. He's the current Minister of Agriculture and Fisheries and is known as a close friend of the King of Morocco. The second company that was the subject of this boycott was Centrale Danone, which is primarily a dairy company. Previously, the majority shareholder was the Moroccan royal family. They sold their shares right before the boycott began. And the third company is Sidi Ali, which is known for bottled water, sparkling water. That one is led by Miriam bin Saleh Shkroun, who is a prominent member of the business community, the private sector in Morocco, with close ties to the government as well. This boycott had tangible effects. And by tangible, I mean Sidi Ali and Danone both released profit warnings to their investors, indicating significant drop in revenues, upwards of 50% in the drop in their profits. So this all started because of a boycott campaign on social media. And the third movement that I wanted to talk about is a little bit more recent. It's called Masaktesh, means I will not be silenced. This also began on social media, but coincidentally today is their first action on the ground. The action has been dubbed Ilad Sarsfari, which translates to if he harasses you, whistle. These women have been handing out whistles throughout the country in major cities and inviting women to blow the whistle whenever they get sexually harassed on the street. This is today. It just started today, actually, so probably tomorrow it'll be on the headlines. I've been following it, and it seems like there's been a lot of international media attention on this. So what does this tell us, right? Across the board, Morocco, Tunisia, and Algeria, these states have been consolidating power. But the nature of dissent is adapting to these constraints. And I think these cases in Morocco show that. With Hirak, we had widespread arrests and violent clashes as well that have resulted in numerous casualties. So these people are adapting their way of expressing dissent, right? Social media has been a major key to this. But then it goes a step further, right? Because these are having tangible effects beyond social media. We're seeing these companies, their revenues are dropping. And with the Masaktesh, we'll see, I guess, tomorrow what was the significance of the impact of their campaign today. But I want to say that, just because protest movements in these countries are not demanding Isqat al-Nizam, or the downfall of the regime, the slogan of the 2011 uprisings, it doesn't mean that they don't reflect political objectives. All of these countries are contending with high youth unemployment. In Morocco, it's 29%, Algeria, it's 26%, and Tunisia, it's 36%. So this is sort of like one of the unifying characteristics of the Maghreb. These have also been a major driving factor in sparking immigration, primarily to Europe. And this is where Europe comes in, right? So we can't discount the impact of foreign stakeholders in the Maghreb, especially the European Union now, because the Maghreb is a major source of migration to Europe. That's one factor. And then there is also the fact that there are major financial stakes for the European Union in the form of trade agreements and major investment deals. So the European Union is heavily invested in the outcome of whatever happens in the Maghreb. And it is, in their interest for the status quo to remain. I want to conclude by pointing to another common factor among these countries, which is the ways in which the leading figures of these states reflect a significant detachment with the population. You have King Mohammed VI, who travels abroad quite frequently. This has earned him the title of the King in Absentia. Now, we do have a government in Morocco, we do have a prime minister, but ultimately power and authority remains within the hand of the monarchy. And then in Algeria, you have Bouteflika, as I mentioned, 81 years old, bound to a wheelchair after suffering a stroke in 2013. He's rarely seen in public, and I in fact think that the last time he actually spoke in public was 2013 or 2014. And then in Tunisia, you have President Beji Caid Sebsi, who is 91, just a few months younger than Queen Elizabeth of England. And as I mentioned, he served under the government of the ousted President Ben Ali. So it's evident that Algerians, Moroccans, Tunisians share an overwhelming sense of frustration over the stagnant nature of the socioeconomic and political realities in their respective countries. And we're seeing this frustration expressed in a variety of forms, as I mentioned. So whether it's through inventive protest measures or simply fleeing the country, as many Moroccans, Algerians, and Tunisians have been doing, these indicators point to a glimmering spark of lingering dissent that has the potential of igniting into major upheaval. And so my conclusion here is that the afterlives of the uprisings are far from over, and we are likely to see new reiterations of the 2000 uprisings in the Maghreb within our lifetime. So thank you.